In 1893, Frank Lloyd Wright founded his architectural practice in Oak Park, a quiet, semi-rural Chicago suburb. It was at his Oak Park studio during the first decade of the 20th century that Wright pioneered a bold new approach to domestic architecture, the Prairie style. Inspired by the expansive landscape of America's Midwest, the Prairie style was the first truly American architectural style of what has been called the American century. For Wright, the houses he witnessed around him, derived as they were from the styles of other countries and other cultures, could not possibly reflect American values. A masterful architectural designer, Wright developed a unique vocabulary of space, form, and pattern that represented a dramatic shift in design from the traditional houses of the day. Wright's Prairie buildings, defined by gently sloping roofs, low proportions, quiet skylines, suppressed heavy-set chimneys, sheltering overhangs, low terraces, and outreaching walls sequestering private gardens, heralded a new era in architecture.
Just imagine the Midwest Prairie, flat, expansive, spreading out in all directions. Imagine a house doing the same thing. That's the Prairie style. Characteristically, they'll have sloping roofs, broad eaves, ribbons of windows, open plans of rooms that flow into each other.
Wright's visionary buildings required a particular type of client, described in his own words as American men of business with unspoiled instincts and ideals. He found the perfect client in the ambitious young businessman Frederick C. Robie.
Frederick Robie was a brash young man who worked in his dad's business, the Excelsior Supply Company. Robie was kind of the rebellious young son, kind of a tough guy, a little bit of an attitude. He wanted to try new things. He designed his own low-slung car that if you look at it, it was like a sports car before there were sports cars. He marries, gonna raise a family, time to have a house. He actually wanted a Frank Lloyd Wright house before he even knew who Frank Lloyd Wright was, because he was a guy of ideas. He said he needed lots of light. He didn't like artificial light. He wanted to be able to look out around his neighborhood, but he didn't want to be seen and observed at the same time. He wanted rooms that weren't confining. And so he would tell this to people, and they'd say to him, "Huh, you want one of those Wright houses." First, he didn't know what they were talking about, but even when people meant that Wright house is something kind of a little off and unusual, I think that made it appeal to Robie even more. Wright got the job. Robie got exactly the kind of house that he wanted.
Completed in 1910, the house Wright designed for Robie is the consummate expression of his Prairie style. The house is conceived as an integral whole, site and structure, interior and exterior, furniture, ornament, and architecture. Each element is connected. Unrelentingly horizontal in its elevation, and a dynamic configuration of sliding planes in its plan, the Robie house is the most innovative and forward-thinking of all Wright's Prairie houses.
The materials are very expressive in the Robie house. Just think of a house spreading out, the line of horizontal. If you think of houses before, they were often big vertical boxes with the windows just being little holes cut into the wall. This house spreads out. Everything about it says horizontal.
On the exterior, bands of brick and limestone anchor the building to the earth, while overhanging eaves and dramatic cantilevered roofs shelter the residents. The dramatic horizontality of the house is reinforced at every level of the design, from the iconic roofline to the very bricks and mortar of the building itself. Through his use of materials, Wright achieves a remarkable balance of tone and color, as iron-flecked brick harmonizes with the iridescent leaded glass of the windows that encircle the building. Broad balconies and terraces cause interior and exterior space to flow together, while urns and planters at every level were intended to bloom with the seasons. The expansive living space at the heart of the home is one of the great masterpieces of 20th century architecture and design. The light-filled open plan is breathtaking in its simplicity, a single room comprising a living and dining space, divided only by a central chimney. Doors and windows of leaded glass line the room, flooding the interior with light. Iridescent, colored and clear glass, composed in patterns of flattened diamond shapes and diagonal geometries, evoke floral forms, while subtly echoing the plan and form of the building. In his design of the Robie House, Wright achieves a dynamic balance between transparency and enclosure, blurring the boundaries between interior space and the world of nature beyond.
It's interesting to think of what residential architecture would look like had Frank Lloyd Wright never existed. He changed everything, and he changed it very quickly. What he was able to create and the ideas that he was able to spread with his buildings became the norm rather than something that was unusual.
In October of 1909, with construction underway at the Robie House, Wright left America for Europe to work on the publication of a substantial monograph of his buildings and projects. The result was the Vosmuth portfolio of 1911, which introduced Wright's work to Europe and influenced a new generation of architects. The Robie House would be the last of Wright's true prairie houses. On his return from Europe, Wright would re-establish his architectural practice in Wisconsin. While he continued to explore the concept of organic architecture, Wright would seek new influences beyond that of the Midwest prairie. Wright would go on to create such masterpieces of modern architecture as Falling Water in 1939 and the Guggenheim Museum, completed in 1959. The Robie House, however, remains as one of the defining moments of the architect's career.
Frank Lloyd Wright evolved the Prairie House over many years, and this comes almost at the end of the period that he was creating the Prairie House, and it's almost like for this last great gesture, he did one of his finest works. Frank Lloyd Wright himself considered this one of his favorites. People who lived in this house remembered him suddenly showing up at the doorstep, walking through and saying, "This is one of my best works," and indeed it is. It shows kind of a perfection of everything he was hoping to achieve.
In 1991, the house was recognized by the American Institute of Architects as one of the 10 most significant structures of the 20th century. Today, the Robie House stands as an important part of America's cultural heritage, a powerful declaration of Wright's uncompromising vision for a new American architecture.